For 30 years, Margaret Foster lived the quiet life of a small-town librarian. She cataloged books, helped students with research, and knew every family in Millbrook by name. But when a mysterious box of antique documents was donated to the library, Margaret stumbled upon a secret that powerful people had been hiding for over a century, and they would do anything to keep it buried. Welcome to Still Human. Here we explore how ordinary people can change the world with extraordinary courage. In this story, you'll witness how one librarian's dedication to preserving history became a fight to save her town's future. This is about knowledge as power, corruption in high places, and what happens when a small-town librarian becomes the most dangerous woman in America. Before we dive into Margaret's incredible story, tell us where you're watching from today. Which city? Which country? Share in the comments. We love connecting with our global community of truth seekers. And if you believe that knowledge is the most powerful weapon against corruption, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Because every day we share stories that prove ordinary people can do extraordinary things. Millbrook, New Hampshire. Population 8,847. The kind of small American town where everyone knows everyone, where high school football games are major social events, and where the public library is still the beating heart of the community. Margaret Foster, 58 years old, had been the head librarian of Millbrook Public Library for 3 decades. She was exactly what you'd picture when you hear small-town librarian. Reading glasses on a chain, sensible shoes, cardigans in every color, and an encyclopedic knowledge of every book in her collection. Margaret's library wasn't fancy. Built in 1892 with funding from Andrew Carnegie, it was a beautiful brick building with tall windows, creaking wooden floors, and the kind of old book smell that made readers feel at home. The budget was tight, the staff was small, and Margaret often stayed late to reshelf books herself. But what Margaret lacked in resources, she made up for in dedication. She knew which books would help struggling students, which novels would comfort grieving widows, and which research materials could unlock local mysteries. She had turned the library into more than a repository of books. It was the town's memory bank. Every morning Margaret arrived at 7 a.m., an hour before opening, to prepare for the day. She'd start the coffee, check the returned books, and review her to-do list. Her routine had been the same for 30 years, and Margaret liked it that way. Predictability was peaceful. But on Tuesday, September 15, 2023, Margaret's peaceful routine was about to be shattered by a simple cardboard box. The box arrived with a note. From the estate of Eleanor Whitmore, please find these documents a proper home in your historical collection. The Whitmore Family Trust. Eleanor Whitmore had been Millbrook's oldest resident, a 97-year-old woman who had died peacefully in her sleep the week before. She had been something of a local legend, the last remaining member of one of Millbrook's founding families, a woman who claimed to remember stories her great-grandmother had told her about the town's early days. Margaret had always enjoyed her conversations with Eleanor. The old woman would visit the library every Tuesday, checking out historical fiction and sharing stories about the old days that were probably half memory and half imagination. But Eleanor's stories were always interesting, and Margaret had encouraged her to write them down. Now, Eleanor was gone, and her family had donated her personal document collection to the library. Margaret expected to find family photos, maybe some old letters, perhaps a few historical curiosities that would make nice additions to the local history section. She didn't expect to find a conspiracy that had been hidden for 127 years. Margaret opened the box that afternoon during her lunch break. The documents inside were carefully preserved in acid-free folders. Eleanor had clearly cared for them properly. There were daguerreotypes from the 1800s, handwritten letters in fading ink, property deeds, and what appeared to be business correspondence from the late 19th century. As Margaret began cataloging the collection, she noticed that many of the documents related to something called the Millbrook Land Development Company, a business entity she'd never heard of, despite her extensive knowledge of local history. The deeper Margaret dug, the more intriguing the story became. According to the documents, the Millbrook Land Development Company had been formed in 1896 by a group of investors from Boston and New York. Their purpose was to purchase large tracts of land around Millbrook for future industrial development. But what caught Margaret's attention was a series of geological surveys from 1897. The surveys indicated that the land around Millbrook contained significant mineral deposits, specifically lithium ore. Margaret paused. Lithium was incredibly valuable in 2023, essential for electric vehicle batteries and renewable energy storage. But in 1897, lithium had been considered worthless. The surveys must have been conducted for some other reason. As Margaret continued reading, she found correspondence between the Land Development Company and a man named Harrison Blackwood, described as a mineral rights specialist. The letters made it clear that Blackwood had identified valuable deposits beneath Millbrook, but the technology to extract them didn't exist yet. The most shocking document was a handwritten agreement dated December 3, 1896. In it, the Millbrook Land Development Company agreed to purchase mineral rights to over 4,000 acres surrounding the town for the sum of $12,000, approximately $400,000 in today's money. But here's what made Margaret's blood run cold. The agreement specified that the mineral rights would remain valid in perpetuity, meaning forever, regardless of changes in technology or the value of the minerals. Margaret realized she was looking at a time bomb. If this agreement was still legally valid, it meant that someone or some company owned the mineral rights to virtually the entire town of Millbrook. And with lithium now worth thousands of dollars per ton, those mineral rights were worth billions. The question was, who owned the mineral rights now, and did they know what they had? Margaret spent the rest of the week researching property law, mineral rights legislation, and corporate succession. What she discovered was both fascinating and terrifying. The Millbrook Land Development Company had been dissolved in 1923, but its assets had been transferred to something called the Blackwood Trust. The Blackwood Trust had been managed by a law firm in Boston, Crawford, Morrison and Associates, for over a century. Margaret had heard of Crawford, Morrison and Associates. They were the same law firm that had recently approached Millbrook's town council with an offer to purchase the entire historic downtown district for $50 million. Suddenly, everything made sense. The law firm wasn't interested in the buildings or the land itself. They were after the mineral rights that their client had owned for 127 years. The $50 million offer was a bargain compared to the billions in lithium deposits beneath the town. But there was a problem with their plan. Margaret had found the original documents, and buried in Eleanor Whitmore's collection was a single sheet of paper that could change everything. The document that would save Millbrook was hidden in the middle of Eleanor's collection, filed between a recipe for apple pie and a letter from Eleanor's great-aunt. It was a single page, handwritten in fading brown ink, dated January 15, 1897. The document was a codicil, an addition to the original mineral rights agreement, and it contained a clause that Margaret was certain the lawyers had never seen. The codicil stated that the mineral rights agreement would become null and void if the development company failed to begin extraction operations within 30 years of the date of this agreement. Since no mining operations had ever begun in Millbrook, the mineral rights had legally reverted to the town in 1927. Margaret read the codicil 3 times to make sure she understood it correctly. If this document was authentic, and Margaret's experience with historical documents told her it was, then the Blackwood Trust's claim to Millbrook's mineral rights had expired nearly a century ago. The billions of dollars in lithium deposits belonged to the town of Millbrook and its residents. Crawford Morrison and Associates represented clients worth hundreds of millions of dollars. They had been planning this mineral rights acquisition for years, possibly decades. They wouldn't give up billions in lithium deposits because of a piece of paper found by a small-town librarian. Margaret needed help, but she didn't know who to trust. The town council was already negotiating with the law firm. The mayor seemed eager to accept their $50 million offer. How many people in Millbrook's government were aware of what was really happening? Margaret decided to do what librarians do best: research. She spent the next 2 weeks quietly investigating Crawford Morrison and Associates. What she found was a law firm with a reputation for aggressive tactics, questionable ethics, and clients who preferred to operate in the shadows. The firm had been involved in several high-profile cases where small towns had been forced to sell valuable land for far less than it was worth. In each case, the communities had been pressured to make quick decisions, often with threats of economic consequences if they refused. Margaret also discovered that the Blackwood Trust's current beneficiary was a mining consortium backed by foreign investors. The consortium had been quietly acquiring mineral rights across New England for the past 5 years, always through intermediaries, always with contracts that heavily favored the buyers. But Margaret's most disturbing discovery came when she started researching what had happened to other people who had opposed Crawford Morrison and Associates in the past. 3 years earlier, a geology professor at the University of Vermont had published a paper questioning the legitimacy of a mineral rights deal involving the law firm. 6 months later, the professor had been arrested on fabricated research fraud charges that ended his career. 2 years before that, a county clerk in Maine had raised questions about a land deal involving the same law firm. The clerk had been fired for mishandling public records and blacklisted from government employment. The pattern was clear. People who threatened Crawford Morrison and Associates' business interests faced serious consequences. Margaret realized she was in danger, but she also realized she was the only person standing between her town and a billion-dollar theft. Margaret's first step was to authenticate Eleanor Whitmore's documents. She contacted Dr. Richard Palmer, a forensic document examiner at Dartmouth College, explaining that she needed expert analysis of some historical papers for the library's collection. Dr. Palmer's examination took 3 days. When he called Margaret with his results, his voice was filled with excitement. "Margaret, these documents are absolutely authentic. The paper, ink, and handwriting all date to the 1890s. But, more importantly, the codicil you showed me would likely hold up in court. This is a legitimate legal document that could invalidate any subsequent claims to those mineral rights." Margaret thanked Dr. Palmer and asked him to keep their conversation confidential. Then she called the one person in Millbrook she knew she could trust, her nephew David Foster, a lawyer who practiced environmental law in Boston. David listened to Margaret's story with growing amazement. "Aunt Margaret, do you understand what you found? If this document is legitimate, it means Millbrook owns billions of dollars in mineral wealth, but it also means you're going up against some very dangerous people." "I know," Margaret replied. "That's why I need your help." David agreed to research the legal implications of Margaret's discovery. Within a week, he had confirmed her analysis. The codicil appeared to invalidate the Blackwood Trust's mineral rights claims, and the deposits would legally belong to the town of Millbrook. But David also warned Margaret about the challenges ahead. These lawyers won't give up without a fight. They'll claim the codicil is fraudulent, question its authenticity, and try to bury this in litigation for years. You need to go public with this information before they can suppress it. Margaret knew David was right, but going public meant putting herself directly in the crosshairs of people who had destroyed other lives to protect smaller secrets. Margaret decided to start with the town council. On Monday evening, October 12, 2023, she requested time to address the council during their regular meeting. Mayor Robert Chen was surprised to see Margaret on the agenda. "Ms. Foster, this is unusual. The council is meeting tonight to finalize our negotiations with Crawford, Morrison and Associates. Is your matter urgent?" "Mr. Mayor," Margaret replied calmly, "I believe I have information that will significantly impact those negotiations." Margaret presented her findings to the town council in the same methodical way she would help a student research a school paper. She explained the historical context, showed them authenticated copies of the documents, and walked them through the legal implications of the codicil. The reaction was explosive. Councilman James Wright accused Margaret of fabricating documents to disrupt a beneficial deal for the town. Councilwoman Lisa Martinez demanded to know where Margaret had obtained the papers and whether she had the legal right to examine them. But Mayor Chen's reaction was the most troubling. Instead of excitement about the potential windfall for Millbrook, he seemed angry that Margaret had discovered the information. "Ms. Foster," Mayor Chen said coldly, "these are very serious allegations. I hope you understand the legal consequences of making false claims about the validity of business contracts." Margaret left the town council meeting with a clear understanding. She was on her own. Within 24 hours of Margaret's presentation to the town council, her life became a nightmare. On Tuesday morning, Margaret arrived at the library to find her computer had been hacked overnight. All of her research files about the mineral rights had been deleted, and the system had been infected with malware that made it unusable. Tuesday afternoon, Margaret received a phone call from the State Library Commission informing her that a complaint had been filed questioning her professional competence and alleging that she had been mishandling historical documents. Wednesday morning, Margaret's nephew David called with devastating news. Someone had filed a bar complaint against him, alleging that he had been providing unauthorized legal advice and improperly advising clients to challenge legitimate business contracts. Wednesday evening, Margaret found her car tires slashed in the library parking lot. The message was clear: back down or face escalating consequences. But Margaret Foster was a librarian, and librarians are trained to be stubborn about the truth. Instead of backing down, Margaret decided to fight back with the most powerful weapon she had: information. Margaret had made copies of Eleanor's documents and stored them in multiple locations before her computer was hacked. She had also scanned everything to digital files that she kept on secure drives hidden in her home. On Thursday morning, Margaret drove to the offices of the Millbrook Gazette, the town's weekly newspaper. She asked to speak with editor Tom Harrison, a man she had known for 15 years. "Tom," Margaret said, "I have the biggest story in Millbrook's history, but publishing it might put both of us in danger." Tom Harrison listened to Margaret's story with the skepticism of an experienced journalist. But when Margaret showed him the authenticated documents and Dr. Palmer's forensic analysis, Tom realized he was looking at a bombshell. "Margaret, this is incredible. But you're right about the danger. Crawford, Morrison and Associates will come after us with everything they have. Are you sure you want to do this?" "Tom, if we don't tell this story, Millbrook will lose billions of dollars that belong to its residents. How can we not tell it?" The Millbrook Gazette published Margaret's story on Friday, October 23, 2023. The headline read, "Local Librarian Discovers Billion-Dollar Secret. Millbrook Owns Valuable Mineral Rights." The story included copies of the historical documents, expert authentication, and a detailed explanation of how the mineral rights had legally reverted to the town nearly a century ago. The reaction was immediate and intense. Within hours of the Gazette's publication, Margaret's story was picked up by regional newspapers, then national media. The David versus Goliath narrative. By Saturday morning, news crews were in Millbrook, interviewing residents and asking hard questions about the town council's dealings with Crawford, Morrison and Associates. Sunday afternoon, Margaret received a call from the Attorney General's office. The state was opening an investigation into the mineral rights claims and the town council's negotiations. Monday morning brought the best news of all. Environmental law firms from Boston and New York were contacting Margaret, offering to represent Millbrook pro bono in any legal battles over the mineral rights. Crawford, Morrison and Associates tried to fight back. They claimed the codicil was fraudulent, filed lawsuits challenging its authenticity, and attempted to intimidate Margaret with threats of legal action for interfering with legitimate business contracts. But the media attention had made Margaret untouchable. Public support for the librarian who saved her town was overwhelming, and any attempt to silence her would only generate more negative publicity. The legal battle lasted 8 months. Crawford, Morrison, and Associates spent millions of dollars on expert witnesses, document challenges, and procedural motions, but Dr. Palmer's authentication of the codicil held up under scrutiny, and additional forensic experts confirmed that Eleanor's documents were genuine. On June 15, 2024, exactly 9 months after Margaret's discovery, a federal judge ruled that the codicil was valid and that Millbrook's mineral rights had legally reverted to the town in 1927. The ruling meant that Millbrook owned approximately $2.3 billion worth of lithium deposits beneath the town. But the most satisfying moment for Margaret came during the town council meeting where the mineral rights settlement was finalized. Mayor Chen, who had opposed Margaret's investigation from the beginning, was forced to publicly thank her for saving the town from a potentially devastating financial loss. Today, Millbrook is the wealthiest small town in New Hampshire. The lithium mining operation, managed by an ethical company chosen by the residents, generates enough revenue to eliminate property taxes, fund excellent schools, and provide every resident with a substantial annual dividend. Margaret Foster retired from her position as head librarian in 2024, but she didn't stop working. She founded the Margaret Foster Institute for Document Preservation, a non-profit organization that helps small communities preserve and research their historical records. You never know what secrets are hiding in old papers, Margaret tells the groups she speaks to. History isn't just about the past, sometimes it's about protecting the future. The Millbrook Public Library now occupies a beautiful new building funded by the mineral rights revenue. But Margaret insisted that they keep the original 1892 Carnegie Library as a museum, dedicated to preserving local history. And in the museum's main display case sits a single sheet of faded paper. The codicil that saved a town and proved that knowledge truly is power. Margaret Foster's discovery didn't just save Millbrook, it inspired librarians and archivists across the country to look more carefully at the historical documents in their collections. 3 other towns have since discovered valuable mineral rights or land claims hidden in their archives. Crawford, Morrison and Associates was investigated by multiple state bar associations and eventually dissolved. Several of its partners faced criminal charges for fraud and intimidation. At Still Human, we believe that truth has a way of surfacing, even when powerful people try to bury it. Sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is a librarian with access to the right documents. What secrets might be hiding in your local archives? What injustices could be corrected with the right piece of paper? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell, because every day we share stories that prove knowledge is the ultimate weapon against corruption. See you in the next story.